Awesome. We're recording. Hello, friends. Welcome. My name is Nicole Grant. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the executive director of 350 Seattle, a climate action organization that gets people from all walks of life plugged into the movement to hold climate polluters accountable and foster resilient communities through Green New Deal style policies. I'm so happy that we can be here together tonight. When How's Our Neighbors came to 350 Seattle with a plan to tap into affordable housing practices from around the world with climate justice at the heart of it, our grassroots volunteers were very excited. And I think it's because anybody who lives or works or recreates in Seattle knows that we're in the midst of a highly visible housing crisis that's making it hard for most people to make it in a very expensive area. And every bit as visible, clear to see, is the climate crisis. Whether it's wildfire smoke or heat waves, it's reached deadly proportions. And at this point, we need every option on the table. And signing the petition to get Initiative 135 for social housing on the ballot is one of the smartest things that we can do for housing, for equity and anti-racism, and for climate justice. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight as we dive deep into the climate case for social housing. So let's meet the panelists. Let's start by introducing Renaissance, my coworker. Renaissance is a descendant of enslaved African peoples brought to these lands during the first diaspora, of the Cherokee people, and also of Irish immigrants, colonizers. He is an intersectional organizer and activist working for 350 Seattle and partnering with How's Our Neighbors, Power Past Fracked Gas, and Whose Streets Our Streets. As a formerly incarcerated Black person who grew up in poverty, Renaissance understands the importance of centering the leadership of those who are directly impacted by systems of oppression. He believes that those who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. Furthermore, uplifting and trusting the lived experiences of oppressed people is vital to our collective liberation and community well-being. So, it's with great pleasure I make that introduction. And I would also like to introduce our panelist, Mike Eliason. Mike is a researcher, writer, urbanist, and licensed architect based in Seattle. He's also the founder of Larch Lab, an architecture and urbanism studio / think and do tank engaged in design, research, policy, and activism. At Larch Lab, they work at the intersection of the climate and housing crises, focusing on decarbonization, climate adaptation, circularity, mass timber, and passive house. Mike and Larch Lab also advocate for bouwgroepen, a form of urban co-housing which is community-oriented, amenity-rich, multi-generational, family-friendly housing, and emphasizes non-market social housing. So I think we've got the very best set of panelists you could imagine for a conversation about social housing, the climate crisis, and Initiative 135 tonight. And of course, the secret ingredient is everybody who's here listening, watching, learning in your own community, household, family, friend group, workplace and bring in the message back. So we have a lot of great questions for this conversation tonight, and I'm just going to go ahead and kick it off. And I would actually like both panelists to answer this question, but if you would start, Renaissance, what does green development and climate justice in housing mean to you?
Well, it means a lot. And if I have a little bit of grace, there's some more that I'd like to say just before answering the question, and I hope that we have the time for that. The first thing I like to say is that we're chiming in Seattle, which is occupied Duwamish land, the Coast Salish peoples. Also connection in here are the Snohomish peoples, the Tulalip peoples, the Muckleshoot peoples, the Puyallup peoples, Suquamish peoples, Stillaguamish peoples, and that we're talking about housing folks in unceded occupied lands. And this is a very complex issue when we're talking about displacement and access and needs. So as we're beginning, wanted to make sure that we're acknowledging that, especially since we're in a city that's namesake for Shiosh. I hope I've said that correctly. In addition, I'd also like to share that my contextual background is a bit more complex than what's written into my bio. I've slept outside. I've slept in bushes. I've slept under bridges. I've slept in shelters. I've been through drug treatment. I'm 21 years sober. So I've dealt with drug addiction. I've been to prison and incarcerated a whole bunch. So I've dealt with a lot of the issues that are coming to the forefront while we're talking about the housing issue. And at the same time, personally, right now in my state in life, I'm quite a bit far removed from actually being in those situations. But lived experience is vital to the conversation that we're having. And I thought that that was important to note as we're talking about that for why these issues are important to me. Now, to answer the question of why do I believe that green development and climate justice in housing, what do they mean to me and how do they function together? I pause a lot to make sure that I say exactly what it is that I intend to say. We have to be able to address our most immediate threats and concerns if we're going to solve the planet. And like the message that I wrote on the background that I have for this video, there is no climate justice without racial justice, without gender justice, without economic justice. In order for us to achieve the planet that we're hoping to be on, you know, if there's going to be a planet for us, then we have to address the most immediate concerns. And safety and security are vital and are paramount. And if we're not addressing that, then we're missing a major element of what it is that we're fighting for as climate organizations or organizations working towards climate justice. So by building housing that is not only sustainable, but is helping those who are being hurt and impacted first and foremost by the changes to the climate as they happen in real time. That means folks that don't have access to shelter, that are dealing with the inclement weather, that are suffering from those things, and helping them to be in places that are built to be sustainable and to withstand the conditions that we're dealing with. That should be number one of many of the things that we're working on, is helping the folks who are the most harmed in our locality to deal with that. And hopefully we're doing that in a way that doesn't negatively impact or distribute harm throughout the global majority that oftentimes people refer to as a global south, but all the rest of the way throughout the planet or into the rural areas of our own state. So we're building in such a way that we're not distributing that harm to other folks. That's where we should be focusing our energy at.
Thank you so much. Mike, what does green development?
Yeah, no, can I just, I'll just say that I want to double everything that Renaissance just said. For me, it's about access, right? So it's access to affordable housing. It's access to the city, the right to the city. It's access to green jobs, sustainable jobs, high-tech jobs. It's access to affordable daycare. It's access to an industry where sustainable products can be made locally, right? So we could do maybe prefabricated straw panels that are lifted by, cranes, unions. It's kind of all of these holistic green aspects of it, right? It's about being able to walk, bike, or roll to your school safely, to be able to live on a street where you're not going to be inundated with traffic pollution, car pollution. We also have the airport. There's the sound and pollution impacts of that as well. It's really about making, I think, housing that's affordable, making neighborhoods that are walkable, sustainable, and also just resilient, right? So there's economic resilience, there's climate resilience, and it's really like how we kind of weave all these things together. There are so many disparate impacts that we're not really paying attention to, and for me, it's really, I think you nailed it, Renaissance. We have to start addressing all of these issues, because until we do those things, we're not going to have the sustainable neighborhoods we really need, right? We're not going to have integrated and affordable neighborhoods that we need, right? And so it's really about it's that access, right? And so it encompasses across all levels: accessible apartments, accessible housing, grocery stores. So to me, that's really what it's all about.
Thank you both. All right, Mike, this one's for you. Can you describe to us and explain what passive house means, how it works, and why it's a key component of Initiative 135?
Yes, so I prepared a couple of slides, and we'll do kind of a really high-level overview of what passive house is. Are you guys able to see? Are you all able to see this? We good? Can I get a thumbs up or? All right. So so passive house is an ultra-low energy standard. It was invented by German and Swedish physicists, but it's really based on a lot of the conservation and energy efficiency principles that were established in the US, kind of running up to and after the energy crisis in the 70s. And there's these histories of crises in our country, right? So the climate crisis is a big one. We also have the housing crisis. Nicole, earlier you were talking about wildfire smoke. We have wildfire smoke season now. The heat dome last year was just unbearably stressful for so many people, and hundreds of people died. Flooding. In a lot of ways, it feels like the US construction industry especially is really wholly unprepared for this, right? Like, we don't have the right green jobs yet. We don't have passive house mandates on our buildings. We don't really have multiple functions for buildings as fresh air breathing centers or cooling centers when it's too hot. And we started to see some of these changes in the last year, but the issue of climate adaptation and dealing with kind of these dramatic, changes in the way that our environment is and affects us, I think, are things that are going to be becoming more and more prominent over the next decade. And so this is a big reason why I became a passive house consultant a long time ago, and have been talking about it ever since. So it's really just an energy efficiency standard. You can take it as like thinking of, okay, we have a building, how do we make it as energy efficient as possible? And there are other things that we can do outside of that, but it's really, it boils down to energy efficiency. But in doing that, it's also about comfort, and it's also about durability. So there are really three principles or requirements to achieve passive house. One is that we have to have and this is just boilerplate stuff, it's specific heating and cooling demand of 15 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. Basically what this means is that you need a hair dryer to heat your home or office, right? So it's about kind of reducing those loads so that the energy that is needed to heat and cool your building is really low. This is really important because it means that we can get off of fossil fuels. So we can have fossil fuel free buildings, we can kick gas to the curb and do all those good things that we should have been doing a long time ago anyway. It's also a requirement to achieve a specific primary energy demand of 120 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. Basically what this means is your entire energy consumption, so your heating, your ventilation, your cooling, your plug loads, your TV, laptops, everything else that you use, right? All of that gets multiplied by a source factor, and it has to be below this 120 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. And this ends up being pretty efficient. And then you also have to have an air tightness of 0.6 pascals, 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. What this means is there's this treatment to make the building as airtight as possible. We'll come in, we test it, depressurize it, overpressurize it, and make sure that there's not energy leaking through that building, because when energy and air are leaking through buildings, there's condensation issues, there's pollution that can come in and out of the facade that way, the noise comes through as well, and wildfire smoke now too. So it's really about kind of addressing this multitude of issues that, especially in an urban city like Seattle, we have to deal with. And then just to give kind of a really quick overview, this is sort of how much energy an existing building would use. Our current codes, Washington is pretty much a leader in green codes, but even then our energy requirements are nowhere near as demanding and strict as they are in the European Union right now. And Passive House is all the way over here on the left. So it's even more energy efficient than, energy built green was at 4-star, and some of the Department of Energy home challenges. So it's really about kind of lowering that load. And so how do we do that? Well, there's a couple of strategies to do that. The air tightness is a big one, and I'll talk a little bit about that. There's also utilizing high performance windows. So in Seattle, it generally means 3-pane windows. So currently, new buildings have to have 2 layers of glass. What we're doing is we're adding a 3rd layer of glass, and this has a couple of really great results. One, you're not going to get condensation, so mold and moisture building up on your windows, right? It's a huge issue for public health, right? And so like we're eliminating that. They're reducing the amount of heat that's flowing in and out, and it's also better for sound transmission too. So your unit is quieter. We're optimizing the level of insulation, so we're kind of adding just a little bit more insulation to the building just to make it just a little bit more efficient. But it's really about kind of optimizing it, so you don't have to have like, huge thick walls of insulation, especially on multifamily buildings. And so you do all this stuff. You make your building airtight, you have this extra insulation, you have high performance windows, but you need to breathe. And so the object that really makes this possible is the heat recovery ventilator. It's basically a box, kind of acts like your lungs a little bit, right? So fresh air comes in, stale air goes out. We'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, but there's a process in there to extract the heat from the stale air that's going out, put it into the fresh air so that you're not having any temperature differentials in your unit, and it's comfortable and it's quiet. So for the insulation, right, it's just a continuous insulation around the whole building. Think of it as like a thermos or a fur coat or, a puffy jacket, something along those lines. There are a ton of decarbonized materials that are available even here in the US now. Cellulose, which is recycled paper, or Holzfaser, which is a wood fiber. And there's some companies in the US that are going to start fabricating more of this. There are other forest industry byproducts that can be used as well to kind of add that extra insulation that we need to be a little bit more energy efficient, reduce the thermal bridging in the building, and just make it more optimal. So triple pane windows, you can kind of see here, 1, 2, 3 pane windows. So it's high performance. There is a cost increase associated with Passive House. What the metrics kind of work that it's not a significant increase, and there's actually a fair amount of affordable housing being built in places like Massachusetts and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania for almost no increase in costs. And so there are ways to kind of mitigate the increases, and there are also offsets, right? So your energy bills will be lower, and if you think about like your energy costs plus your housing costs or rent or whatever, you kind of keep it all flat, but you have a better building. It's about airtightness, and so we use membranes, tapes, gaskets, basically to go all the way around the building, right, to make sure that air isn't leaking through, right, because that's the condensation issues, which means there's moisture in our wall, there's durability concerns, and things of that nature. And also, penetrations, making sure all of our penetrations through the building envelope are secure as well. And so I talked about the blower door test, the air changes per hour, the air tightness, right? So we come in, everything is tight. We'll test the air tightness of the building at 50 pascals. And this is really just a test to ensure, okay, how tight are we, right? How much energy are we actually losing in the envelope of the building? And in a Passive House, the amount of air leakage is so small that it's really like the size of like a pencil hole in your wall, right? Like it's just incredibly tight and incredibly efficient. So here's the heat recovery ventilator. It's basically just a box, and they come in really small sizes for small apartments or retrofits, all the way up into big units that you can walk through. So you bring in your fresh air. Your fresh air is cold, right? Or if it's summer, it's probably warmer, but generally it's cooler here. The stale air that's coming through, the heat is extracted out of that. It's cycled into that fresh air, so that when that fresh air comes into the building, right, it's not cold. You're not going to get any comfort issues, and it feels good. The other reason this is really important, and this goes back to, I could talk about, the way that we plan our cities in the US is not the greatest either. This is a half a season in a wildfire smoke event in Canada. And it turns out that if you live on an arterial, which is where the city legalizes where most of our affordable housing can go, you're breathing stuff like this too. You're breathing it when there's a wildfire, you're breathing it when Traffic pollution is really high. And so the HRV kind of acts as this barrier, right, to bringing these particulates into your home. And so this is good for a number of reasons, for public health outcomes, right? So your asthma, if you have asthma, your asthma effects will be significantly lower. There's also really great, side effects here in the Pacific Northwest. We always get spiders coming in our place. Well, these buildings don't have spider problems. We talked a little bit about the black mold and the condensation. I think this is a huge one. We've lived in homes here in Seattle, apartments here in Seattle. The black mold issue can just get out of control. And so this is really a means of designing buildings so that we don't have to deal with this, right? So tenants in the future aren't going to have issues with landlords because there are black mold problems in their units. It pairs really well with mass timber. Mass timber is this kind of new way of working with wood panelization systems, prefabrication, and they go really, really well together, hand in hand. If you're into innovative decarbonized materials, like I said, prefabricated straw panels, one single story, multi-story, there's so many opportunities to do things. I think on the decarbonized material side, it pairs really well. I think there's some great opportunity for green jobs. Like I said, prefabrication, and all of this is kind of necessary, right? Because the effort that goes into making a passive house, building a passive house, it's a little bit more intensive than kind of your code minimum construction. And so, all of these things working together, the prefabrication, the decarbonized materials, it's kind of all of those effects are really the quality control check for making a passive house a passive house. It can be utilized for mass timber, passive house, mid-rise buildings like this, social housing project in Graz. I think it's fabulous. It can also be done for retrofit. So part of 135 is, it's not just building new housing, right? It's also getting old housing, and then a lot of old housing needs a lot of work. And so retrofits are, I think, going to be a big component of it. We have old buildings, they're running on fossil fuels. So this becomes a means of getting buildings off of fossil fuels as well. Renovation systems are a huge deal. So so to me, this is kind of where passive house is going, is more of the kit of parts, sustainability side of it. But yeah, so the benefits, and I'll stop the share here. So the benefits, I think, are huge, right? It's you're not going to be sick as much. Your indoor air quality is going to be better. I think there are massive public health benefits. It would be interesting to see if there are health establishments that will see the effects of those, and maybe there's some opportunities for pairing on that as well, right? Like Kaiser Permanente is building housing in other parts of the country, right? Because they need affordable housing. B, let's make that affordable housing sustainable, healthy, and comfortable for all the people who live inside it. Does that answer the question? I think, are we good?
Yeah, I feel like you answered the question, Mike. And I just want to say thank you. Like, I myself am a journeyman electrician, and this is like so tantalizing to me. I can't even stand it. It's really exciting to hear about how architecture can be part of our resilience for the parts of climate change that are right here.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, Renaissance. So you've talked frequently about centering impacted voices in the struggle for climate justice. How do you think this initiative works to do this? How will it impact the environmental footprint of the Seattle social housing developer?
Why do I get to all the big questions? I just want to say thanks to Mike for really diving in deep on what passive house looks like, what it can be like, and many of the different alternatives that can be applied while building or retrofitting facilities so that folks can live in. I know a lot of people have a lot of questions about how that works and how people can be employed. So I really, really appreciate that. And I'm hoping that everybody else does too. In talking about centering those who are most impacted, before diving into what that means for this initiative, I think it's important to place that question or this question into context. And I think one of the major factors that we're dancing around when we're talking about this is capitalism and white supremacy. and transphobia and homophobia and many of the other different phobias or isms that exist in the society that we're in. And to pick up on a real important part that connects not only to our government, but also to the economic structure that we're living in, is that by and large, most of the decisions that have created the laws, the economy, developed the cities, laid out the streets, decided, how punishment was going to happen, where the social safety net is. That means what types of resources, programs that people actually have access to help us survive and thrive in this society were not decided by the folks who are the most impacted, and have primarily been decisions that have been made by wealthy land-owning white men that have a lot of inheritance from one generation to the next systematically. So when we're talking about centering the opinions of those whom are most impacted, that's the context in which we're talking about, and why that becomes very important. And I would be remiss if I didn't think about or make mention to how the actual Initiative 135 came into being and what House Our Neighbors was able to do in bringing folks together, like the people from Stop the Sweeps who were actively out on the streets, confronting how the city of Seattle is attempting to remove and not address the root causes of people who are living in houselessness right now, or by interacting with the folks at Real Change and talking with the vendors to find out, and they were having conversations with all of these folks who are directly impacted and very close to the circumstances that this social housing is hoping to overcome, to find out what it is that people actually need and what people want who are closest to the solution. It's very difficult in this system, but it is a common practice for those who have little to no lived experience, that don't really understand what is necessary, that are making and developing tactics to try to answer problems. But without the buy-in of the people, there can be no common good without the common people. That those things are merely just tactics, and they end up wasting our resources, our tax dollars, and our efforts, and we spin wheels, and we end up not actually addressing the problems, and so then they end up exacerbating. So by having us at the forefront, and by us, I mean those who are the most impacted by the systems that are in place that we didn't actually help to create, makes a huge difference in the outcome, and how people make connections to what it is that we're building. And that was something that House Our Neighbors leaned in really early on with, in helping to develop and write and revise and build out the initiative in the first place. And what made it into the initiative is a governing board that is actually composed of by the tenants, and also folks that are connected to housing projects in the city and through nonprofits. And they're working to pick a very specific person who has a lot of experience in green building, working through the Green New Deal Oversight Committee that was publicly fought from the grassroots up and installed in the city of Seattle, that has a direct connection to all of the communities who were most impacted. And having all of that together in one place shifts the dynamic of this capitalist structure being top down, where the government and people who are far removed from the problems are making decisions, but the decisions are being made on a very small scale. What Movement Generation, in their book on just transition, titled Deep Democracy. And deep democracy is a set of decisions that are being made on a smallest scale possible by community members and people who are working in our community to help build our community. And it shifts the dynamic, and that is one of the most important elements. And if we can accomplish that, which is what this legislation does, then we're actually moving in the direction of what some of the best minds in thinking about what climate justice is and how to achieve it we're on our way to accomplishing that by getting this legislation passed. Did I answer the question, and did I go over time?
You answered the question divinely. I have to say, you know, like, I feel seen, and I think that there's a lot of people in Seattle that feel like, you know, Initiative 135 is by them, for them, and that's not something people are used to with a lot of Seattle power structures. So yes, really appreciate you bringing light to that. Okay, Mike, one for you. What else would need to happen in Seattle to ensure truly green development as the Seattle social housing developer starts up? Like, what more? What else needs to happen?
Okay, so I've got more slides. I'm an architect. This is what I do. I can't help it. Sorry. Give me just 1 second. Okay, so I think that there's a couple of things. The one is the way we do planning in the city is actually kind of horrendous, right? There's not a lot of holistic thinking to it. We kind of jam all the density and affordable housing onto kind of the most polluted streets in the city, right? The arterials, it's along the highway. Like, I think we need to rethink how we're building housing is a big one. So passive house is a big component of that. Where we're building it, what it can look like, how much open space there is. So this is a kind of a brief overview of what Northgate is, you know, planning on looking like in a couple of years. There's a couple of things that stand out to me. One, there's not a lot of social housing. Two, you have these thick buildings. There's not a lot of opportunity for kind of climate adaptive resilient buildings, right? So there's not going to be opportunities for cross ventilation. We don't really have a solar protection industry in the US too. So as you know, things get hotter, how are we going to cool down our buildings and our residents and make sure that they're comfortable? Well, passive house is one mitigation of this, but there are others as well. There aren't a lot of trees in this, as you can see either. You know, and this is Roosevelt. This is the light rail station that also opened up the same time as Northgate. You know, again, this doesn't seem like this very kind of climate adaptive, climate resilient neighborhood, right? There's a little bit of affordable housing here, but there's actually not that much housing that's going in there. And we also, you know, consistent or, you know, with this, we also have our climate goals that we're supposed to be meeting. Renaissance talked about the, you know, the Green New Deal. You know, we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of our climate goals are nowhere close to being met. And thinking about how neighborhoods are developed in other places, there's opportunities for passive house buildings, for mass timber buildings, for climate adaptive buildings. You know, how do we bring greenery into the city? How do we make it accessible for people to walk to? Are there a plethora of housing options for people, right? So that we have a good economic and social mix. Are there opportunities for cooperatives, social housing, market rate housing, Baugruppen, which are kind of urban co-housing? And are there places that people will want to live where they're not inundated by car traffic, where you can have your kids go play outside and, you know, there's ample shade, they're not going to be harassed, you know, and it's a pleasant place to live. This is a development that it's underway in Vienna, Sonnenviertel. All of this is new. This is a huge brownfield development. And when Vienna comes in and redevelops districts in their city, most of the housing is going to be social housing. So already it's kind of in line with like how I think we should be doing urbanism. There'll be ample homes. There'll be a huge mix of homes. It's not going to be all studios and one bedrooms like all of the development that you see here in Seattle, right? There's going to be this healthy mix of studios to 3 bedrooms, sometimes even larger, because guess what? Some people have larger families, multi-generational families, and they need a place to live too. They come in, they'll add a school campus. Your daycare will be kind of on your block so that you don't have to, you know, drive and have a kind of long commute to go to daycare. Oh, and by the way, it's also affordable. Cafes, places to hang out, youth centers, job centers, places for work, like all of this stuff can kind of get crammed in the same area, right? And so it creates this way of living where, you know, you can have a low carbon way of life, you can have an affordable way of life, you can get around without, you know, driving or having a large carbon footprint. There are spaces where kids can play, you know, cars don't have the right of way. You know, it's like, how do we get there? And another project in Berlin that's going to be, I think, really interesting is there's this huge project outside of the Tegel Airport, Schumacher Quartier. It's 5,000 homes, 100% of them are social housing. It's cooperatives and Baugruppen, it's student housing, and it's affordable housing. It's going to be heavily built with local wood or regionally sourced wood. All of the buildings will be 50% timber, prefabrication. It'll be built with robots. It's kind of like this really nutty way of thinking about doing it. But like, how do we get there? I think that we need passive house mandates, right? I think this is the baseline of where everything is going in the EU, and there's a reason for that. And they're also putting a ton of effort into rehabilitating social housing, right? To get a lot of the issues that I talked about existing housing, like that we have here in Seattle, kind of out of the way. And it's also a buoy against energy poverty and all of the public health benefits that come with that. Again, the diversity in housing, right? It's not just market rate housing everywhere you look. It's not just studios everywhere you look. How do we get that, economic and social mix in our cities? How do we get social housing that has ample open space, mix of units, things for people to do, schools, healthcare, all of that stuff kind of integrated into it? To me, like, that's kind of where a lot of the synergies can start to make really wonderful things. Oh, by the way, this is going to be built. It's going to have mass timber. It's going to be passive house. It'll have a daycare, right? Like, I think like an aspirational thing of what we could be doing is definitely there. It's about open space. It's about climate adaptation. A lot of our buildings, I think, are not going to be resilient as things warm up. And so, we also need to be thinking about, okay, how are we retrofitting these, so that we do have climate adaptive city and housing? Are there spaces that kids can play? Are there community gardens where people can come together, have a barbecue, play, soccer, catch, basketball, whatever? I mean, we need those spaces, right? And we don't really we have the space in the city, but we're not using it very effectively, right? So the way that we are zoning our city is a big issue. The mobility issues in the city are huge. Every part of the city, I think, has a massive mobility deficit. And some areas have an even greater one because of historic issues like redlining and segregation and stuff. I think we need social housing mandates, honestly. The city of Paris has a social housing mandate. 25% of all housing by 2025 is social housing, 30% by 2030. Oh, by the way, this is a handsome little building, great little urban French building, right? It's about kind of re-democratizing our streets, blue-green infrastructure, making them resilient to stormwater, inundation, storms, having ample shade to reduce the urban heat island effect, places for people to laze about, hang out with their friends, play with their kids. I think that really this is the direction that we as a city need to be going. I'm an architect based in Seattle. I've worked a little bit in Germany. I'm heavily connected to a lot of things that are going on in Europe. And, Seattle likes to bill itself as like this leader on all of these things. And it's really difficult for me because, I look at what all my colleagues are doing in Europe, and it's like, that's the stuff that we should be doing. Like, how do we take those concepts? And it's going to be different, right? Because the way we do things here in Seattle, I think, has to be more local and organic and, organically raised, right? Like, we have our own things and concepts that we need to bring to it. But we need to start implementing these concepts and, make a city that people want to live in, make a city that people can afford to live in. So does that answer our question?
Yes. Yeah, thanks for sharing all of these slides. But I have to say, these homes are cute, and I'm really attracted to the idea that Initiative 135 is about people having nice things, and then when I hear like childcare is a part of the conversation, just like, man, I'm a mom, and like I have to say, like, childcare costs as much as a mortgage in this city. Like, this is like very serious stuff for people that are trying to raise some kids, and I really like the idea that we can integrate it into our climate action. All right, okay, Renaissance. I have a question for you, and this is my favorite question of the night. Plus, everybody in the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A, because we're going to be going to audience question and answer soon, and would love to hear what's coming up for you and what's on your mind. All right, Renaissance. What is your perspective on how current governing systems are taking an intersectional lens to environmental justice? What could they do better? And do you have hope that this initiative will accomplish those things? Take it away, Renaissance.
Oh, with the big questions. The first thing that comes to my mind is that our people are not being provided the resources that we need for success. I made a reference earlier to the social safety net. And the question, and what I'd like to call into focus now, is intersectionality at its core. And how the issues that many of our people face by those that are in positions of power tend to look at them in isolation, like each one happens in a vacuum by itself. And I'm also thinking about the current political, economic, and social moment that we find ourselves in, while also thinking how harms seem to replicate themselves every generation. I'm thinking about all of these things all at once. And what comes to mind is that we're perhaps on the tail end of a pandemic, but during that pandemic, there was another recession. And in that recession, lots of people lost work. And simultaneous with that, the resources that were devoted to a lot to the social safety net, which would include like healthcare, mental health care, well-being care that might be included in like drug addiction and processing through those things, and many of the other things that a lot of our people need while we're trying to survive in the society. Like a lot of that energy was reallocated to actually addressing what was going on with the pandemic. And we've seen this in recession after recession, how resources and time get reallocated and they stop focusing on that stuff. And just like what happened in the 80s coming through 2008 up to about now, we watch a rise in people that are living on the streets. And so we're talking health concerns and economic concerns. And one thing that I'd like to bring into this conversation is criminalization and how that functions in our society. Because what we're actually taking a look at right now with some of the people who are most impacted by the climate is that poverty and health issues are being criminalized. And for folks who are not familiar with how that term functions or what it means, to criminalize something is to make elements of a person's identity a crime, like sleeping outside or public urination or something like that. When you cannot find access to a restroom or there is no place else to sleep, whether it's in a park or it's in a stoop or it's on a sidewalk or where have you, if the things that a person needs to do in order to survive are made illegal, then they have made that person's identity illegal. And when a person is arrested for that, that is the act of criminalization. Simultaneously, what we're also watching happening right here in Seattle, and the Lavender Rights Project brought this to light within the last month, is that people are being swept and they're being put into the King County Jail, and in the King County Jail, they are dying under very questionable circumstances and in such a high volume that it caught everybody's attention, at least in the social justice world. And so we're looking at multiple elements of a thing happening together. And what I said earlier was it's not addressing root causes. And this is all happening underneath of the government that is the Seattle government, while they're making decisions that aren't actually addressing the things that are causing us to have problems in the society in which we're living. So I believe that the government structure that we are interacting with right now is failing our people. I wrote a lot of notes. We'll see if I'm hitting most of them. The other part of the question is, do I believe that this initiative will help to solve all of those problems? And the short answer is, I don't believe that this initiative will change the government. So I'm not gonna false sell the answer to that question. But what I do believe that this initiative will do is, with the communities that that the social housing buildings and communities that are formed, I think that within those communities, that community power and strength will be built, and community resiliency. That means the ability of that community to answer the problems that it is confronting will not only be empowered, but it will also be resourced, and they will have a connection to the community by being a part of the governance of that community in a very localized way, that it will have drastic differences in outcomes for everybody that's a part of those communities. So I definitely think that this is a very, very real possibility for what this initiative has to accomplish. And just to carry it forward one more step, that when we have that kind of enclave and social cohesion, that the economic structure right now, through disenfranchisement and displacement, often referred to as gentrification, that happens as property values go up and people are pushed out and they tear the communities apart, that social cohesion within the enclaves that these communities are going to create will have political force to be able to influence the way that our government functions, and will have voting power. So I think that there's a very real possibility for that outcome to exist as well, while we're helping to redesign the city that we live in and we love. And with that, I'll bring it to a close and allow for any questions to be asked. Thank you.
That was outstanding. I love that you brought people power into the conversation. I think this is a moment when the question's really being called about is everybody in Seattle going to be enfranchised about how we solve these problems together? And as somebody who's watched displacement and gentrification, just gut and devastate Seattle for a decade or more, it's just like that's hope for me, that Seattle will be able to turn the corner, and get welcoming. All right, so I'm looking to see if we have any questions in the question box, and I see that we do not. But I know that everybody who's come tonight is, just like bringing your intellect and your passion to learning more about this. And so I want to make sure and be extra welcoming. If you think, if there's something on your mind, please don't be shy and type it in. But with that said, I also want to open it up to our panelists and see if there's anything additionally that came up for you tonight. I have loved the vibe between Renaissance and Mike, and getting a complimentary conversation about what's possible with technology and what's possible in a movement. So I would ask you, is there anything else you'd like to add now? Or it would also be a fine time to wrap it up with your closing statements about the panel tonight. Oh.
Do we have a question?
I think I see a question. All righty. An anonymous viewer has asked, okay, thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise. I would be interested to hear the panelists' thoughts on integrating disability justice into social housing and environmentally sustainable cities. I'd actually love to hear from both of you on this. Does Were you about to jump in there, Mike?
I was just going to comment on the last thing that Renaissance said, but we can come back to that. Let's answer the question because it's an important one. Do you want to go first, Renaissance, or do you want me to take it?
You were already talking, and I was formulating a strong answer because I think that's a very important question. If you have something already prepared, please.
Yeah. So this is a really important question, and this is I gave a talk in Montreal earlier this year, and this actually came up because I thought that Canada somehow had better rights for disabled people than the U.S. did, and it turns out that they absolutely do not. And so that was very kind of eye-opening for me on this subject. But I will say that for me, we need to be making it so that all of our units are, at least if not barrier-free, so fully accessible, at least adaptable, right? Like, things happen in life. You don't know where you're going to be, physically or mentally, even in a decade down the line. And so I think having the ability to have spaces that can kind of incorporate and adapt life changes is critical. Like so many of the social housing projects that like I just love and I'm constantly talking about in Europe, right? So there's the mix of units. So as you're aging, right, you start to have kids, so you need a bigger place to live. And then your kids go off and have their own lives. Well, maybe you don't need to have that bigger space anymore. So you can downsize into a smaller unit, either within that building or within the kind of the greater ecosphere or ecosystem of that social housing community. And at the same time, like, you need spaces for assistance. So a lot of them incorporate guest suites that can double as caretakers units or isolation wards in COVID, right? So it's kind of like, it's really about that flexibility that our current housing structure just doesn't have whatsoever. And I think absolutely it has to reach out into the neighborhoods, right? Like, if you can't get around with your assisted device, or however you need to get around, mobility trike, whatever, right? Like, if you can't get to those things in your neighborhood, then it's not accessible for you, right? So I don't, it's not sustainable and holistic in a holistic sense. And so there's a huge topic right now in urban planning about what we thought was going to be great was everything should be walkable. Well, a lot of people can't even walk, right? So it's like, how are we bringing them into the fold and making lives that are functional and habitable for everybody, and not just people who are able-bodied? So that's kind of my really bad, rough take on it, but I'm definitely interested to hear your take on this, Renaissance.
Yes, Renaissance.
I think that a lot of what you brought in, Mike, is real important for like how the building itself is structured, how the apartments are built, what are our changing circumstances. And also when I'm hearing like disability justice, I think one, as a very perceptually able-bodied person, I may not be the best to speak to all of the parameters, and I definitely don't know everything about every disability. So I want to make that disclaimer just as I'm starting this conversation. There are also disabilities that are not visible. I think that what you were sharing, Mike, is about the buildings themselves, and also a bit about the community and the community planning. And I don't know if this initiative by itself will answer all of the problems enough that could actually get to what I would consider would be justice for most folks. The barriers to access, the barriers to entry, the barriers to find solutions to problems. And I think that comes with the other things that we're also fighting for in concert together. What I think is the most important about how the structure of this initiative will help us to address disability justice is the formation of the governing within the community itself. So that's the people within the building or the community actually helping to develop and design the culture of the people who live there themselves. And at that point, at those meetings are where the needs and concerns can be aired, and a plan can be created and addressed. I think that's the strongest part about what this initiative is, and how I think it will best be able to answer that just as a standalone initiative for social housing without the other things that we're also fighting for.
Wow, you guys. And this is such a good question, like fire from the audience. I'll just open up a little bit about like for myself, you know, like my dad has Alzheimer's. It's pretty advanced. And like when I think about like social housing and being able to like be multi-generational and like age and community, and just be able to thwart some of that isolation and vulnerability associated with, you know, dementia and other things involved in aging. It's like, got my vote. Okay, we've got good questions coming from the audience. I wanted to ask Thor Olson's question. All right, here we go. How do you see the drought in California and the Colorado River Valley impacting housing in the Seattle area? Do we take a renaissance? I'd love to hear both of you guys on this question.
So I grew up in Seattle, like Rainier Vista, the Central District, and Renton and White Center. Like I've lived all over the place. And I returned to Seattle 2 years ago after spending 5 years living in Phoenix. And this may not be a very popular opinion, but I don't think that cities like Phoenix, Arizona, as it currently is, or like Las Vegas should exist. And the reason that I bring those two cities into the name is because both of those cities are drawing from the water, the Colorado River in particular, and the Rio Grande. And that, if I remember correctly, Lake Mead is the Colorado River that is the dam that's just outside of Las Vegas that's dumping and emptying out because they're growing lawns all over the place down there. And what I remember from being down there is that like Phoenix and the Southwest is actively trying to run pipes up here to the Northwest to gain access to the farmers' clean water. And how do I think that that will impact it? Like Phoenix, Arizona was one of the fastest growing metropolises of transient folks that were moving in and buying up space down there because they have the room to sprawl, unlike here. While here we have like this new age Silicon Valley thing going on, and there are a lot of people that are moving here for those reasons. And also like Seattle was slated as one of the places that's supposed to be the best able to weather the rising sea level in the future. So people are buying up land for those reasons. I think that all of that stuff is going to have an impact on how valuable land space is for us here, how precious and how expensive water is, and who can actually afford it here in the future if we keep prioritizing profit over people. And I'm going to keep harking on capitalism, because capitalism doesn't focus on what we need as human beings. It bases a well-being metric as being a gross domestic product and not on how well we're feeling with one another and how strong the bonds are within our communities. So that's something that I think we have to change. But it's definitely going to impact what's happening up here in the Northwest if the decision makers decide that they're going to extract water from our farms and send it down to the other places that are just using water that probably shouldn't exist, in my opinion, not the way that they do. I am complete.
Mm-hmm. Whoa. Mike, you want to
yeah, I think it's going to be, it's a multi-pronged thing. I think Renaissance is absolutely right that the issue of resources is going to become even more imperative. The drought in the Southwest U.S. is, I think, the worst it's ever been, and it's only going to get worse. By the way, we thought we were pretty climate proof here in the Northwest, and it turns out we're actually not. Right, like the western slope of the Cascades are drying out. Eventually, do they start burning like we saw in Oregon and California? The last couple of years. I mean, that's going to happen, right? They are drying out. And so there are all of these issues and questions that I have around, okay, one of the reasons that we moved here is because we thought it was going to be, a great place to live long term, right? It's going to be fine climate wise. But then, so we have the smoke season, we had the wildfires, a little bit of flooding, and we'll probably get more flooding and rain events in the future. So I think that we will see a large influx of people moving here for a number of reasons: jobs, climate adaptiveness, somewhat. How it's going to affect the housing market, I think it's especially, it's going to drive up land values. We're going to have scarcity issues. And so one of the things that, that I'm really excited about this initiative is that it's starting to address some of those issues, right? And it's, using public land for public good, right? Like the Mercer Mega Block, Cary Grant and Tiffany at Real Change and I were kind of working on stuff about getting the city to better think how they utilize public land, right? Maybe we don't just sell it off to tech companies. Maybe we get something for the city and the public out of it if it's not going to be housing. And so, it's really like jumpstarting those conversations so that we can be more resilient, right? So we can be more adaptive. I think is what is going to come out of this, hopefully.
Okay, I heard you say jumpstart. I liked how you did that. We have another question, and this is from Adam Kennedy in the audience, and this is fascinating to me too because I also live on an L2 lot. Okay, Adam's asking, if I wanted to build a passive house style co-housing / social housing on residential L2, which is like a designation about how much you can develop a lot, is that feasible? Like, as we start to change single family zoning, what's really possible on an L2 lot?
Sorry, I'm muted. The L2 is kind of like the baseline of where that could start to be feasible. I mean, technically you could probably do something that's co-housing at least on a single family lot. And there's a group out of Columbia City, Frolic, who are trying to do like these really small scale cooperative, affordable community led projects. I think there's one in Columbia City, maybe one in the Central District. And part of that also is about working with existing homeowners to either stay in that site or be part of the redevelopment process. This is definitely something that we've been trying to do for on and off for probably about a decade. My focus is on Baugrouping, which are kind of the urban co-housing. It's definitely, L2 is definitely feasible. Our entire land use code is just not great for developing anything really, except these huge, large buildings. And so like it's part of this larger conversation I think we need to have as a city, and hopefully we'll have it as a comp, as the comp plan process starts going the next year or two is, how do we actually create a city that people want to live in, that's livable, where a diversity of units, economically, socially, ecologically are all possible. But it's definitely feasible. If you want to talk more, definitely reach out.
All right. Well, I see us at coming up on 7:10, so I just want to do a quick time check. I'd really like to hear both of our panelists close it out and to hear from our campaign for a minute. Renaissance, do you want to dive in there?
The best way that I know how to close out anything are not my own words. Assata Shakur, who is one of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense members. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And I think that's a lot of what we're after right now, and what we're doing is shattering those chains and caring for one another. And with that, I'm just really honored that I was asked to be here today. Thank you everybody for showing up. It was a real treasure to be able to hear from you, Mike. Thank you, House Our Neighbors and Initiative 135 for bringing us in and for holding down all this work. And thank you, Nicole, for being our MC and asking us the hard questions.
I just want to, Renaissance, you talked about, community cohesion, and in Vienna, which, this building behind me is one of the most popular social housing projects in Vienna. It's all about solidarity. It's all about looking out for each other. For me, that was kind of the draw to social housing. That's the draw to Vienna. That's the draw to this initiative. And how do we make a city where people can look out for one another and thrive, you know, in every sense of the word. And so I'm just so excited to be able to help out with this. I'm super excited that they're aiming for Passive House. I think this is going to be the most progressive building system energy wise in the US if it does. Great to meet you, Nicole. Same Renaissance. I hope we get to continue these conversations, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be with everyone tonight. And again, big thanks to everybody who's paying attention. I saw that there's two chats in the chat box about how to participate. And does anybody from the campaign want to jump in and make a pitch as we close it out for tonight and enjoy some of this beautiful drizzly May evening? I
can make a quick plug. Yeah. Thank you everyone so much for being here. We really appreciate your time and interest in learning more about the different components of the initiative. We'll be definitely hosting more of these to dive deep into other aspects. But in the meantime, we are in a really big signature gathering push right now. We're trying to get all of ours turned in by June 20th. So this weekend is going to be one of our biggest weekends yet. Friday through Monday is the Northwest Folklife Festival, and we are going to be gathering every single day there. If you haven't signed up yet to help us, you can cover a shift of, you know, only an hour one day, or you can be there the whole weekend if you'd like. But you can sign up at howsourneighbors.org/135events. It's in the chat. And then we're also, as I mentioned in the chat as well, we're a community powered campaign, and any amount that you're able to donate is super helpful to helping us keep this campaign going through November. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Nicole, Mike, and Renaissance for teaching me a lot tonight. It was great.
Thanks, Camille. And with that, wishing everybody the best evening. Hope to see you at the Dropbox for your ballot in November, and gathering signatures throughout the next few weeks, and on the campaign throughout what promises to be a long, hot summer. Take care, everybody.